The first chill of November brushed against my skin as we stepped out of the car, the countryside cloaked in silence, save for the soft rustle of trees and the faint trickle of water running through unseen creeks. The bathhouse stood just beyond a winding path of stone lanterns and golden leaves, nestled between forest and fog, secluded, private, and untouched by the noise of the world. He carried the bags like he always did, walking just a step ahead of me. My son. My grown son. I should have felt at ease, but I didn't. Not today. Something had changed between us lately, something I couldn't quite name. It was in the way his eyes lingered longer than necessary. In the way he stood a little closer than he used to. Not out of rudeness or carelessness, but instinct, as if the space between us didn't matter the way it once did. We had come here to unwind. That was the excuse. A mother-son weekend retreat. A tradition reborn. The bathhouse was an old wooden structure with large panel doors and warm light flickering through rice paper screens. The air smelled of cedar, mineral water, and a faint touch of citrus. As we stepped inside, the world hushed. The receptionist greeted us softly, handed us keys to a private suite, sauna, 2 pools, sleeping mats, all behind a thick curtain of privacy. He opened the sliding door for me and smiled that same smile he used when he was little and proud of himself for doing something thoughtful. But it wasn't a child's smile anymore. It was older, warmer, something else. I nodded my thanks and stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked gently beneath my feet. The room was dim, filled with the glow of lanterns and the steam curling lazily from the hot spring. I could feel the warmth already pressing into my skin through the layers of my coat. "We'll change here," he said, placing the bag down. I turned my back to him, unwrapping my scarf, hanging it slowly. My fingers lingered at the buttons of my blouse. I could hear him behind me, the faint rustle of clothes, the shuffle of bare feet on tatami. There had always been comfort in our silence. But now, that silence felt charged, like something was about to be said or done. My heart tapped gently in my chest. I stepped into the spring first, the water curling around my ankles, then my thighs. I let out a breath as the heat enveloped me, sinking into my muscles. Moments later, I felt the water ripple again. He joined me, settling in across from me. Steam cloaked us like a curtain. He looked at me. Not quickly, not by accident. He looked and didn't look away. "You haven't smiled like this in a while," he said, his voice low, almost lost in the echo of water against wood. "I haven't had a reason to," I answered truthfully. His gaze softened. "I wish you'd let someone take care of you." I laughed quietly. "That's not how the world works for women like me." He tilted his head. "Maybe it should." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with understanding, with memory, with everything we weren't supposed to say. I looked away, my pulse a whisper just beneath my skin. And in that stillness, in that private place between the world and the woods, something delicate shifted. Steam still hung heavy in the air, but the silence had taken on a new shape, no longer a quiet between words, but a presence all its own. I kept my eyes on the rippling water, my fingers tracing the surface, as though it might reveal the thoughts I couldn't speak aloud. Across from me, he hadn't moved. He sat back, arms resting along the wooden edge of the spring, the way a man would in the company of equals. Not his mother. Not anymore. "You always gave everything," he said, voice quieter now, even when no one gave back. His words landed like soft stones in my chest, dislodging things I'd buried too long. I glanced at him, unsure if he meant it as an observation or an accusation. But there was no judgment in his tone, just something like longing. "I didn't mind," I replied. "That's what mothers do." His eyes met mine, searching. "And what about the woman in you?" A pause. No one had asked me that in years. I opened my mouth to answer, but the truth caught in my throat. What could I say? That she was tired? That she had been silent for so long she sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like? He stood, slow and unhurried, water sliding down his chest and arms, glistening in the low light. For a moment, I looked away, embarrassed by my own awareness, by how alive I suddenly felt. "I'll bring us some tea," he said softly, wrapping a towel around his waist. I nodded, unable to speak. When the door slid shut behind him, I leaned back and closed my eyes, heart racing in ways I hadn't felt since I was a young woman waiting for a knock that never came. What was I doing? What was I allowing to bloom in the quiet corners of this bathhouse? Yet I didn't want to leave. I didn't want the moment to end. When he returned, he carried a small lacquer tray with 2 cups of green tea, the steam rising gently between us. He sat beside me this time, not across. Close. Our arms touched as he handed me the cup. "You remember when I was 10, he said, "and we went to that mountain inn?" I smiled faintly. "You wouldn't stop jumping between the hot and cold pools. I was terrified you'd slip and crack your head open." He laughed. "You wrapped me in every towel you could find, like I was made of glass." I looked at him now, at the man beside me. The way his voice had deepened, the angles of his face, the quiet strength in how he held himself. "You're not made of glass anymore," I murmured. "No," he said, his tone matching mine, "but sometimes I still wish you'd hold me like I was." My breath caught. I turned my head, and he was looking at me again, really looking, no longer hiding behind polite glances or careful words. There it was, that current, that forbidden pull neither of us named, but both had started to feel. He didn't move. He didn't have to, because I already knew something was coming, and none of it would be simple. We sat in silence again, though it felt louder now. Every breath between us a question, every movement loaded with meaning. The steam curled between our faces like an invisible veil, and I wondered if it was shielding us from the truth, or pushing us closer toward it. I sipped the tea slowly, more to occupy my hands than to taste it. My fingers trembled just slightly against the ceramic cup. "Why now?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He turned toward me, his brow furrowing gently. "What do you mean?" "This," I gestured vaguely between us, to the hush, to the closeness. "You've changed." He didn't deny it. "I've seen you watching me, not like a son watches his mother." The words felt strange in my mouth, dangerous. But I didn't pull them back. He nodded once, steady. "Because I'm not just your son anymore." I closed my eyes, the truth of it echoing deeper than I wanted to admit. "You were the one person who never left," he continued, his voice low. "You were the one who always saw me, even when I didn't know who I was. And somewhere in all that, I started seeing you too." I set the cup down, carefully, and pulled the towel tighter around my shoulders. I should have said something. Anything to break the spell. But I couldn't lie, not to him. Not to myself. "It's not right," I said quietly. He didn't argue. Instead, he whispered, "But it feels real." And it did. That was the worst part. I stood slowly, needing space, needing air, but there was nowhere to go in the private room. The soft wooden walls pressed in with their quiet acceptance, the warm air wrapping around my bare legs like a sigh. I felt him behind me before I heard him move. His presence was a heat just inches from my back, not touching, but there. "When I was younger," he said, his voice now behind my shoulder, "I used to think love had rules, boundaries, maps. And now," I whispered, still not turning to face him, "now I think love is the one thing that never listens to rules." The words landed somewhere deep in my chest, where fear and longing met. I turned, not all the way, just enough to see his eyes. And what I saw there wasn't lust. It wasn't confusion or rebellion. It was something far more dangerous. It was clarity. "I don't know what to do with this," I confessed, trembling. "With what I'm feeling." "You don't have to do anything," he said, softer now. "Just don't run from it." A beat of silence passed between us. Long, stretched, infinite. I reached up, almost without thinking, and brushed a drop of condensation from his collarbone. The touch was fleeting, but it was enough. Enough to admit what we were both afraid to say aloud. This was no longer about right or wrong. It was about what had already begun. He didn't speak again, and I didn't either. Words felt too small now, too clumsy for the quiet that wrapped itself around us. The steam brushed against my cheeks like an invisible hand, and the water pulsed gently around my legs, warm, grounding. Almost enough to steady me. Almost. He sat back down beside me, but this time, he didn't keep distance. Our shoulders didn't touch, but the space between them felt thin, fragile, like the next inhale might close it. I could feel his warmth. That was the problem. Or maybe that was the reason I stayed. "I used to think you were invincible," he said suddenly, voice low, steady. "When I was younger, I thought nothing in the world could ever break you." I let out a soft, humorless breath. Everyone breaks, just not all at once. He turned his head slightly. "What broke you?" The question was gentle, careful, like he already knew I carried the answer somewhere deeper than words. I stared into the water, watching my reflection ripple, distort, reform. "Life," I murmured. "Loneliness."
"Time."
The feeling that I was always giving, always holding everything together. And no one ever asked if I wanted someone to hold me. His breath left him in a quiet exhale. Not sympathy. Recognition. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. "You couldn't have," I replied softly. "You were a child." "I'm not anymore." The room felt like it tilted, just a fraction, just enough to shift the air. No declaration. No confession. Just truth. I leaned my head back against the wooden wall behind me and closed my eyes. Not to hide. Not to retreat. But because it was easier to speak in the dark of lowered lashes. "Do you know what scares me?" I whispered. "What?" "That if I look at you for too long, I won't be able to look away." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of the one thing we pretended not to feel. He didn't move closer. He didn't touch me. But his voice lowered to something warm enough to stir the deepest parts of me. "Then don't look away." My heartbeat echoed in my ears.
Soft.
Unsteady. Human. "I'm your mother," I reminded him, reminded myself. "And I'm your person," he answered. The words hit harder than anything else could have. Not romantic. Not careless. Not impulsive. Just real. The kind of truth that had grown over years. Quietly. Patiently. Inevitable. I opened my eyes. He wasn't staring at my body. He wasn't hungry or reckless. He was simply there, entirely present, seeing me the way no one had in years. Not as caretaker. Not as guide. Not as someone who should be strong. But as a woman. A woman who had been alone for far too long. A woman who still wanted to be seen. Held. Understood. My voice felt like a thread when I spoke. "What happens to us now?" He shook his head, slow, deliberate. "We don't decide that tonight," he said. "Tonight, we just feel." No promises. No lines crossed. Just two hearts, suspended in the heat of a quiet room, closer than they should be, closer than they've ever been. I didn't take his hand, but I leaned my head, just slightly, just enough, toward him. Not touching. Just near.
And he didn't move away.
The warmth of him radiated against my skin, steady and real, grounding and dangerous and achingly familiar. And in that closeness, something inside me finally exhaled. The night didn't answer any questions. It simply opened them. The lamps had dimmed to flickering embers, and the sounds of water had quieted into distant echoes. We had dried off in silence, each movement deliberate, like we were afraid to make a sound that might disturb the delicate thing that had formed between us. The sleeping room was small and low-lit. 2 futons were laid out side by side, the scent of cedar and freshly laundered linen settling into the air. It was quiet in the way only deep night can be, the kind of quiet where even thoughts seem to echo. He changed behind the screen first. I waited until I heard the soft rustle of the blanket before slipping behind it myself. I moved slowly, folding the robe, slipping into my nightshirt. Soft cotton, old, comforting. It covered everything. And still, I felt exposed. When I returned to the room, he was lying on his back, hands behind his head, eyes open, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. I climbed onto my futon without a word. The distance between us could be measured in inches. The silence between us could be measured in heartbeats. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "I keep thinking about the way you looked at me earlier." I turned slightly, resting on my side to face him. "How did I look at you?" He swallowed, his voice barely a breath. "Like you were afraid to want me." My breath caught. "I'm not supposed to," I whispered. "I know," he said. Neither of us moved. The quiet filled with everything unspoken. Not lust, not recklessness, but something deeper. Something that had grown not out of sudden impulse, but slow-burning need.
Not for a body.
But for connection. For being seen. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured after a long silence. "Because every time I closed my eyes, I imagined your hand in mine." I stared at the space between our futons, the impossibly small gap. "I thought about it too," I confessed. He turned his head. Our eyes met in the dark. He didn't reach for me. He waited. He always waited. And that patience, that aching restraint, was somehow the most dangerous thing of all. "Is it wrong?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "That I don't want to be alone tonight?" "No," he said. "It's not. I just want to feel something real." His voice came back steadier this time. "Then come closer." The invitation wasn't physical. It was emotional.
It wasn't do something.
It was feel something.
I didn't move into his bed.
But I shifted closer. Inch by inch, I let my fingertips fall over the edge of the blanket, just enough that if he reached, we might brush. I heard him shift too. And then his fingers were there, not holding, not grasping, just touching mine.
Light.
Like the whisper of a question. Like the pause before a kiss that never comes. And in that tiny thread of contact, I felt more seen than I had in years. No one said another word. We lay there, hands barely touching, bodies apart, hearts open. It wasn't what I expected, but it was everything I needed. I didn't sleep for a long time. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to miss a single second of what it felt like.
To be wanted.
Without being asked for anything. To be held. Without being taken. To be near the edge. And not fall. Not yet. I looked at him, really looked at him. The faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his shirt clung slightly to his chest from the humid air, and those eyes, gentle, searching, familiar. There had been so many moments like this before. Moments we brushed aside with laughter or silence. When hands accidentally touched for too long, when glances lasted a beat more than they should have. We had been careful. So careful. But care could only hold back so much for so long. "I don't know if I should be here," he said, voice rough. "Then why are you?" He didn't answer, not with words. He stepped forward. I stood. And just like that, we were close enough to feel each other's breath. My heart beat like it hadn't in years. Not from fear, not from guilt, but from something that felt achingly alive. He raised a hand, slowly, giving me time to pull away. I didn't. His fingertips brushed my cheek, featherlight. I closed my eyes, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel everything. "You don't have to be afraid," I whispered. "I'm not," he replied, and I could hear the truth in his voice. "Not anymore." And then he kissed me. Gently, as though testing the shape of a dream. His lips were warm, tentative at first, and I felt a tremble in my knees that I hadn't felt since I was a girl. My hands found their way to his chest, resting there, feeling the steady thrum of his heart beneath my palms. We pulled back barely an inch. His forehead pressed against mine. "I've wanted to do that for so long." "I know," I breathed. And I kissed him again. This time slower, deeper. No longer tentative. No longer pretending. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate, tender, and aching. Years of silence, of what-ifs, poured into that kiss. And for once, neither of us looked away. When we parted again, I reached up to cup his face, holding it like it was something precious. Because it was. This doesn't make sense, I said, voice trembling. Maybe not, he murmured. But it feels right.
And it did.